Derek Lawson stood in his penthouse office, a sprawling view of Manhattan unfolding beneath him. The sunset cast an orange hue across the skyscrapers, but he barely noticed. His hands rested on the glass windows, his fingers tracing invisible lines over the cityscape he had helped build through years of relentless work. Yet, every accomplishment, every new deal, only served to deepen the sense of emptiness that had settled in his life. "Sir, you have a meeting in 15 minutes, Martha," his longtime assistant announced softly from the doorway. Derek turned around, offering a curt nod. Martha hesitated, a concerned look crossing her face. "You sure you're all right?" she asked. Derek forced a smile. "I'm fine, Martha. Just lost in thought." She nodded and left, but her eyes betrayed what everyone around him suspected. Derek Lawson, the untouchable tycoon, was barely holding himself together. He was a man defined by his losses, by a past that refused to be buried no matter how high he climbed. The loss of Grace, his wife, still haunted him. Every corner of their once shared home felt hollow, a museum of what had been. Her laughter that used to fill the hallways, her presence that made their massive estate feel warm. Now, silence reigned supreme. In the months following her death, he had thrown himself into his work, driven by an unquenchable thirst to escape the grief. Philanthropic initiatives in her name, charity events, and endless investments in causes she would have loved, all in the hope of keeping her memory alive while running from his own pain. But nothing seemed to work. That night, as he stepped out of his chauffeured car and walked up the granite steps to his mansion, Derek noticed how empty it felt. The large windows, the immaculate gardens, the elegant facade. None of it mattered. He could afford the world, but he couldn't buy back the life he'd lost. It was on a particularly grim November afternoon, during a charity visit to St. Anne's Orphanage, a place he supported financially, that his life took an unexpected turn. The air inside the facility was warm, in stark contrast to the cold drizzle outside. Children played in the common room, laughter and chaos filling the space. Derek watched from a distance, offering his usual donations and mechanical smiles, until something, or rather, someone caught his eye. A small girl, no more than 6 years old, sat quietly by the window, drawing with intense concentration. She had dark hair pulled into 2 messy pigtails and a face that seemed eerily familiar. Derek found himself moving toward her, as if drawn by some invisible force. "Hey," he said, crouching down beside her. She looked up, her wide green eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze, a strange mix of innocence and old soul wisdom that unsettled him. "Hello," she replied, her voice soft but confident. Her name tag read Lily. "What are you drawing, Lily?" he asked, trying to suppress the tremor in his voice. The sketch she was working on was simple but beautiful. A little house surrounded by wildflowers, the kind Grace had loved. "It's my happy place," she said matter-of-factly. Her small hand reached up and scratched at her left arm absently, revealing a faint mark on her skin. Derek's breath caught in his throat as he noticed it. A birthmark, crescent-shaped, identical to one Grace had. It was just a mark, but the sight of it sent his heart racing. Where did you get that?" he stammered. She tilted her head. "My birthmark? I've always had it." Her eyes narrowed slightly, her child's intuition sensing his unease. Derek felt a pang in his chest, an inexplicable pull, as if some part of his late wife had been reborn in this child. He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair, and made his way out of the common room. Outside, in the crisp air, he struggled to steady his breathing. He couldn't explain it. Something about Lily had stirred a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, mixed with a flicker of fear. A fear that maybe, just maybe, fate had more twists in store for him than he could ever anticipate. Derek sat in the back of his limousine, the engine purring softly as it cut through the gray drizzle of Manhattan streets. The memory of Lily's birthmark danced around his thoughts, refusing to let go. He rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of the unsettling recognition that gripped him. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his reverie. It was a message from Martha, reminding him of the back-to-back meetings he had scheduled for the rest of the day. but the usual importance of his business empire felt muted, almost insignificant. He found himself drawn back to the small, determined face of the girl at the orphanage. Her quiet presence, her simple joy as she drew her happy place. It gnawed at him in a way he couldn't explain. "Change of plans," he said, leaning forward toward his driver. "Take me to the west side. St. Anne's Orphanage." The driver raised an eyebrow through the rearview mirror but didn't question him. Derek rarely made spur-of-the-moment decisions like this. As they wound through traffic, he tried to think rationally. What was he doing? It was just a mark, a coincidence. Yet, something inside him whispered otherwise. Back at St. Anne's, the air was filled with the sound of children laughing and playing. The staff bustled around, trying to keep order, but it was clear the joy of the place lay in its chaos. Derek entered, his imposing figure drawing a few curious looks from the children. Sister Margaret, the head of the orphanage, greeted him with a surprised but warm smile. "Mr. Lawson, we didn't expect to see you back so soon," she said, adjusting her glasses. Derek managed to smile, his mind racing for a plausible excuse. "I wanted to spend more time with the children. See how the programs are running firsthand." Margaret seemed pleasantly surprised. "Of course. That's very thoughtful of you. The kids love visitors, and it's been a while since someone of your stature took such a personal interest." He nodded, but his eyes scanned the room, searching for Lily. She wasn't in the main hall. Margaret noticed his distraction. "Is there anyone specific you'd like to meet? I can introduce you." Before he could answer, a small voice called out, "Mr. Lawson." He turned to see Lily standing there, clutching her drawing pad close to her chest. Her eyes lit up as she approached, and the knot in his stomach tightened. How could such a small child hold so much of his attention? "Hi, Lily," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. "Still drawing?" She nodded, then hesitated, as if debating something. "Do you want to see?" she asked, holding out the pad. Derek took it and studied the drawing. She had added more detail to her scene. The wildflowers seemed to burst from the paper, and there, standing in front of the house, was a woman with flowing hair. Grace. He felt his chest constrict. "That's beautiful," he said, his voice cracking just slightly. "Is that your happy place?" Lily nodded, her gaze serious for someone so young. "I don't really remember my mom or dad, but I like to imagine this place is where they would be." She paused, as if considering whether to share more. "The sisters here say that everyone has a family out there somewhere, even if they don't know them." Derek swallowed hard, the familiar ache of loss mingling with a newfound sense of urgency. What if this child was more than just another orphan he could help through charity? What if she was connected to him in a way he couldn't yet understand? He cleared his throat, trying to hide his discomfort. "Lily, do you know anything about your family? Where you came from?" She shook her head, her expression turning wistful. "No. The sisters told me I was found when I was a baby, near the edge of the city. No one came to claim me." She said it so plainly, with the resilience that only a child could muster, but it broke something inside Derek. He clenched his fists, the idea of anyone abandoning this bright, hopeful little girl filling him with a silent rage. Margaret approached, having overheard the last part of the conversation. "Lily's story is unfortunately not that uncommon, Mr. Lawson," she explained gently. "We do our best to give these children a sense of family, but of course, some gaps can't be filled." Derek nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere, formulating a plan. He couldn't walk away now, not with all these unanswered questions swirling around him. There was something about Lily he couldn't let go of, and he needed to know why. As he stood there, he felt a pull, an undeniable, emotional tether that connected him to this small child, this puzzle he was now determined to solve. "Sister Margaret," he said after a moment, "I'd like to spend more time with Lily. Maybe even discuss adoption." The words felt monumental as they left his mouth, and even Margaret looked taken aback. But before she could respond, Lily's face lit up with a joy so pure it made the air seem brighter. "Really?" she whispered, her eyes wide. Derek knelt down to her level, his own heart hammering in his chest. "Yes, really," he said, and in that moment, he knew there was no turning back. Several weeks passed, each one drawing Derek and Lily closer as he navigated the process to officially adopt her. The paperwork, the interviews, the evaluations, all were grueling and invasive. Yet, Derek found himself looking forward to every step that brought him closer to making Lily a permanent part of his life. Each day that he spent with her felt like a step towards something new, something he hadn't felt in years: hope. One chilly afternoon, Derek took Lily to Central Park. He watched as she raced ahead, her laughter echoing through the trees, a bright sound against the muted colors of autumn. She stopped near a bench to pick up a leaf, examining it as if it held some hidden secret. "Derek," she called, still holding the leaf. He smiled at her small voice, calling him not Dad, but simply Derek, a formality she hadn't yet been able to let go of. "Did you have a family?" He nodded, feeling the familiar pang in his chest. "I did," he replied, his voice soft. "My parents are gone now, and my wife. She passed away some years ago." Lily's eyes softened. "Was she nice?" He chuckled, feeling a bittersweet warmth spread through him. "Yes, she was. She was kind and thoughtful. She used to make the world feel like a happier place." He paused, watching her expression change as she took in his words. "You remind me of her sometimes." "Really?" she asked, wide-eyed, as if it were a wondrous secret. "Yes," he said, smiling. "Really." They sat on the bench together, and she leaned against him, her small body fitting easily into the hollow left by his folded arm. As they sat in comfortable silence, he noticed something on her arm, just below her sleeve, a small, crescent-shaped birthmark. He stared at it, his pulse quickening. It was identical to the one Grace had, a mark she had once told him ran in her family for generations. "Lily," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "how long have you had that mark on your arm?" She looked down, her small fingers tracing the birthmark absent-mindedly. "Always," she replied simply, shrugging as if it were no big deal. "Why?" Derek struggled to form his thoughts, the pieces in his mind swirling in a disorienting pattern. He remembered Grace, sitting by the fireplace on winter nights, telling him stories about her family, about how her great-grandmother had a similar birthmark and how it was believed to be a sign of resilience, a blessing passed down from one generation to the next. He forced himself to stay calm, trying not to scare Lily with the intensity of his reaction. "It's just interesting," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. That evening, once Lily was asleep, Derek found himself in his study, poring over every piece of documentation he could find. His mind raced, returning to the day Grace had passed. They had discussed having children, even imagined what it would be like to see a little one running through their home. Grace had longed for it, and he remembered the silent promise he'd made to himself to honor her wish. But after her death, he had never thought he would find a child who could fill that void, until now. Derek's gaze fell on the family photo albums, and he pulled them down, one by one. Flipping through the pages, he found photos of Grace as a child, her mother, her grandmother, all with the same faint crescent-shaped birthmark. His heart thudded painfully as he stared at the images, each face wearing the same mark Lily had. A thought gnawed at him, the same question spinning in his mind. Could Lily somehow be connected to Grace? But how? He would have known if his late wife had given birth, wouldn't he? The next day, Derek arranged a meeting with Sister Margaret, hoping she might have some information that could help him understand who Lily's birth parents were. Sitting across from him in her modest office, Sister Margaret took a deep breath, as if bracing herself for the conversation. "Derek," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you've been very persistent in wanting to know about Lily's past. I have to tell you that what we know is limited." He leaned forward, every nerve in his body taut. "Anything would help, sister, even if it's just a small detail." Margaret gave him a compassionate look. Lily was brought here as an infant. She was found near the edge of the city, with no records, no trace of where she'd come from. There's nothing in the files, and we never heard from anyone who might have been her family. We thought it was odd. Her clothing was simple but well-made, as if she'd come from somewhere safe. But no one ever came forward. Derek's jaw tightened. He wanted to push further, to demand answers that simply didn't exist. It was as if the world had erased any clue to her origins. He clenched his fists, struggling to maintain his composure. But what if she was somehow connected to my wife? Margaret's brows knitted together in surprise. Do you think? I don't know, Derek admitted, a raw honesty in his voice. But there are too many coincidences. Her birthmark, the way she feels like a part of my life that I'd thought was lost. Margaret studied him, her eyes softening. Derek, it's possible that sometimes people come into our lives for reasons we can't fully explain. Maybe Lily was meant to be with you, even if we never find out why. She reached across the table, her hand resting on his in a rare gesture of kindness. If you love her, then that's all she needs. You can give her a family, a future. Isn't that reason enough? Derek nodded, but he left the office with more questions than answers, his mind swirling with the weight of Margaret's words and the gnawing mystery that he couldn't ignore. As he made his way down the orphanage's hallways, he passed Lily's room. She was sitting on the floor, her legs crossed, scribbling away at a new drawing. She looked up, her eyes lighting up at the sight of him. Derek, look, she said, holding up her latest creation. It was another drawing of the little house, surrounded by the same wildflowers she had drawn before. But now, in front of the house, she had added two figures, a man and a woman standing together. Derek felt his throat tighten, his heart thundering in his chest. It was as if this small girl were painting the life he and Grace had once dreamed of, and he could no longer ignore the possibility that somehow Lily might be the miracle he never thought he'd find. The following week, a sense of purpose fueled Derek as he dove deeper into his investigation of Lily's origins. He reached out to social workers, sifted through records, even hired a private investigator, yet every trail seemed to end before it began. It was as if Lily's history had been wiped clean. Frustrated, he found himself pacing his study late at night, the silence of his mansion broken only by the ticking of an antique clock and his own restless thoughts. The next morning, Martha walked in, her brow furrowed as she watched Derek scrutinize yet another stack of papers. She cleared her throat. Derek, are you sure this is a good idea? She asked, her tone soft but cautious. I mean, this obsession. It's not like you. He glanced up, his face lined with exhaustion. I know how it looks, Martha, but I can't shake the feeling there's something more here. Something important. He sighed, rubbing his temples. Do you think I'm making a mistake? Martha studied him, her gaze unwavering. No, I don't, she said, and Derek could see genuine concern in her eyes. But I think you need to be prepared for what you might find. You've been through so much. I just want you to take care of yourself, too. Derek gave a weary smile. Thank you, Martha. I don't know what I'd do without you. She nodded and slipped out of the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He glanced at the clock, realizing he was late to pick up Lily from the orphanage for their planned outing. Tossing the papers aside, he grabbed his coat and headed out, pushing the questions from his mind, if only for a few hours. That afternoon, Derek took Lily to the zoo. Her excitement was infectious, and for a brief time, he felt a genuine lightness he hadn't felt in years. She laughed, pointed at every animal, and held his hand tightly as they walked through the exhibits. It felt normal, and he realized, with a pang, how much he wanted this to be his life, to be her father, officially and unconditionally. At the elephant exhibit, Lily tugged at his sleeve. Derek, why do elephants never forget? He chuckled, looking down at her inquisitive face. Because they have good memories, I suppose. They remember where they come from, who their family is. Lily nodded thoughtfully, then looked up at him, her small fingers still clutching his hand. Do you think I'll remember this? With you? Derek felt his heart twist, but he managed a warm smile. I think you will, Lily. And I hope you remember me for a very long time. She smiled, her gaze filled with a trust that both uplifted and frightened him. He wanted to be worthy of it, but he still couldn't shake the questions that lingered. He had to know where she came from, to understand if there was a connection to Grace that went beyond coincidence. The following day, Derek arranged to meet with the director of St. Anne's, hoping to dig a little deeper into Lily's records. But as he flipped through her sparse file in the director's office, His frustration grew. Her intake form was thin, almost barren of detail. It noted that she was found abandoned near a small hospital in upstate New York, a facility that had since been shut down. There was no indication of her parents, no clues about her origins. The director sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Mr. Lawson, I know this isn't the answer you want, but we've tried everything we can to uncover more about her past. We simply don't know where she came from." Derek set the file down, his jaw clenched. "You mean to tell me there's no record of her family?" No one came forward, not a single inquiry. The director shook his head sympathetically. "We've seen cases like this before, I'm afraid. Some children are abandoned with no ties left behind. And as hard as it is to accept, we have to focus on giving them a future." Derek stood, still fuming but grateful for the director's time. He walked out into the hall, passing the rooms where other children were playing, and found himself outside on the orphanage steps, staring up at the sky. The autumn air was crisp, the kind that bit at his skin and sharpened his mind. He was so close to giving up, to accepting that maybe Lily's past would remain a mystery forever. But as he sat on the cold stone steps, he remembered something: the journal. In the months after Grace's death, he had packed away many of her belongings, unable to face them. Among them was her journal, filled with her thoughts and reflections. A private place where she had shared her hopes, her fears, and her dreams. Derek had never read it, feeling it was too personal, too sacred. But now, it felt like the only place left to turn. He went home, dug through the storage boxes in his closet, and found the journal buried beneath layers of memories. It was worn, the edges frayed, but as he held it in his hands, he felt a rush of Grace's presence, like she was standing beside him, waiting to guide him. Sitting down on his bed, Derek opened the first page, his eyes scanning over her familiar handwriting. The entries were filled with moments of their lives together, stories about their shared dreams, and snippets of her day-to-day thoughts. But one entry in particular caught his attention. It was written just a few weeks before her death. It was the first time she had mentioned her pregnancy. Derek's heart skipped a beat as he read the words, the careful way she had expressed her fears. She wrote about how scared she was to tell him, fearing he would worry too much. She described how excited she was, how she dreamed of their child's future. And as he read on, he realized why she had kept it from him. The pregnancy had been high risk, something she had hoped would resolve on its own. But as she continued to document her experience, it became clear that things had grown worse. She had been in and out of doctor's appointments, consultations that he had never known about. And then, in her final entry, she mentioned a nurse, a kind, dedicated woman who had helped her through the worst of her pain. Grace had left a note, a simple line that was underlined, as if to highlight its importance. "If something happens, trust her." Derek sat back, his mind reeling. Who was this nurse? And what had she known about Grace's pregnancy that he didn't? Was it possible, even remotely, that their child had survived, that some series of tragic misunderstandings had led her to be lost? Clutching the journal, Derek felt a determination harden within him. He had spent years running from the past, burying it beneath layers of wealth and work. But now, the past was calling him back, demanding answers he couldn't ignore. With a trembling hand, he picked up his phone and began his search. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew he had to try. For Lily, for Grace, and, at long last, for himself. Derek's search for answers led him to the very edge of his memories with Grace, and as he pieced together fragments of their past, one name kept resurfacing: Nurse Evelyn Klein. She was mentioned more than once in Grace's journal, each time with gratitude and quiet admiration. Grace had described her as the one person who made everything feel a little less frightening. Armed with the name, Derek made calls, reaching out to old contacts and scouring online records. Finally, he found a lead. Evelyn Klein was still living, now retired and residing in a small town upstate. It was a long shot, but if anyone knew the truth about Grace's final days, it would be her. The next morning, Derek set off. A tight knot of hope and anxiety lodged in his chest. The drive was quiet, each passing mile thickening the sense of anticipation. What would he learn? And was he truly prepared for whatever answers lay at the end of this journey? After nearly 4 hours, He reached a modest retirement community nestled among tall, quiet pines. The receptionist gave him directions to Evelyn's unit, and a few moments later, Derek found himself standing at her door. He took a deep breath and knocked. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a frail woman with silver hair and a gaze that seemed to peer straight into his soul. She was small, her frame delicate, yet her eyes held a spark of life that age hadn't dimmed. "Miss Klein?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "Yes," she replied, studying him closely. Her expression softened. "You must be Derek Lawson." He blinked, taken aback. How did you know?" She gave a slight smile, opening the door wider to invite him in. "Grace spoke about you often. She loved you very much." Inside, the space was simple and warm, filled with photos of family, old books, and trinkets from a lifetime of memories. Derek followed her to a small seating area, and they sat facing each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "I never got a chance to meet you," Evelyn began, her hands resting lightly on her lap. "But Grace, she was such a lovely soul. She used to say that you were her strength, even when things became unbearable." Derek felt a tightness in his throat. "I didn't know she was struggling," he said quietly. "Not the way you're describing." Evelyn nodded, a look of sympathy in her eyes. "She was determined to spare you from worry. She knew the pregnancy was risky from the start, but she believed she could handle it. When things became more complicated, she still held on to hope." Derek clenched his fists, fighting a wave of emotions. "Why didn't she tell me?" "She wanted to protect you," Evelyn replied gently. "She hoped that if things went wrong, you would remember her as she was, not as she'd become." She paused, glancing at a photo of Grace on the wall. Toward the end, her condition worsened. The doctors had to make a choice, either save Grace or try to save the baby. Derek's heart pounded, each beat louder than the last. "What happened, Evelyn?" Evelyn looked at him, her expression both compassionate and sorrowful. "The baby survived, Derek. It was a miracle, really. But there was a mix-up. When Grace passed, they recorded the child as abandoned. There was so much chaos, and you were unreachable for days." She broke off, shaking her head. "The hospital filed her as an orphan and sent her into the adoption system before anyone could correct the error." Derek felt the room spin. His mind reeled, trying to grasp the weight of what she was saying. "You're telling me that my daughter was put up for adoption?" "Yes," Evelyn whispered. "I tried to intervene, but by the time I had sorted through the paperwork, she was gone. She'd already been moved to another facility. I searched for her as much as I could, but..." She trailed off, her face etched with regret. Derek leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his head in his hands. All these years, he had been living in the shadow of Grace's memory, mourning the family they never had, while his daughter, had been out there, lost in the system. Evelyn's hand reached out, resting gently on his arm. "I am so sorry, Derek. I can't imagine the pain this must cause you. If I had found her, if I had managed to track her down." But her words drifted away as Derek's mind raced. The pieces were finally clicking together. The birthmark, the little house with wildflowers in her drawings, the feeling he'd had when he first saw her. Lily wasn't just a child he was drawn to. She was his child, his own flesh and blood. Derek stood abruptly, barely aware of Evelyn's startled look. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "Thank you for telling me. I have to go." He rushed out of her home, barely feeling the cold bite of the autumn air as he climbed back into his car. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, the enormity of the revelation crashing over him like a wave. His daughter, Lily, had been with him all along. The drive back was a blur. Derek's mind was a storm of emotions, joy, rage, disbelief, all colliding at once. He replayed every moment he'd spent with Lily, every instant he had felt that inexplicable connection, as if some part of him had known the truth all along. By the time he reached Manhattan, evening had fallen, casting the city in deep shadows and glinting lights. He went straight to St. Anne's, his heart pounding as he pushed through the doors and asked for Sister Margaret. Within minutes, she appeared, a look of concern etched on her face. "Derek, "What's wrong?" she asked, sensing his distress. He took a deep breath, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Lily, she's my daughter." Sister Margaret's eyes widened, but before she could respond, Derek pressed on, his words tumbling out. "I know this is going to sound impossible, but I've confirmed it. There was a mistake. She was placed here by accident. All this time, I didn't know, but now I do." Margaret stared at him, absorbing his words, her expression a mix of astonishment and understanding. "Derek, are you absolutely certain?" "Yes," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "I can't explain it all now, but I know it's true. I need to take her home. She deserves to be with her family." Margaret's gaze softened. "She loves you, Derek. She's been waiting for someone like you her entire life. I could see it the first time you two met." Tears blurred his vision as he thought of everything Lily had endured, all the years they had been separated. "I won't let her down," he vowed. "I'm going to give her the life Grace would have wanted, the life she deserves." Sister Margaret placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Then go to her, Derek. She's waiting." Derek nodded, his heart swelling with a fierce determination. He turned, making his way down the familiar hallways until he reached Lily's room. Pushing the door open, he found her lying on her bed, curled up with a book. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a pure, radiant joy that made his heart ache. "Derek," she exclaimed, setting her book aside. "You came back." He crossed the room in a few quick strides, kneeling beside her and taking her small hands in his. "Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to tell you something. Something very important." She looked at him, her expression turning serious as she sensed the gravity in his voice. "You're not just someone special to me, Lily. You're my daughter," he said, his voice breaking on the words. "You're my little girl." For a moment, she stared at him, her face a mixture of confusion and wonder. Then, as if understanding dawned all at once, she threw her arms around his neck, holding him as tightly as she could. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and joy. Derek closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face as he held her, a sense of completeness filling him at last. After all the years of loss, of grief, and of longing, his family was finally whole. The days after Derek's revelation were a whirlwind. Adjusting to his new role as a father was both exhilarating and overwhelming. He had transformed his life overnight. Meetings rearranged, travel plans canceled, projects put on hold, all in favor of spending time with Lily. She had become the center of his universe, and he approached each day with a fierce dedication to making up for lost time. One evening, as they sat together in her new bedroom, filled with toys, books, and walls painted in warm pastels, Derek noticed something he hadn't seen before. Lily was humming softly to herself as she played with a dollhouse he had bought for her. She seemed happy, but there was a certain tension in her movements, a hint of something hidden behind her smiles. "Lily," he said gently, taking a seat next to her on the floor, "are you okay? You seem quiet." She looked up, her expression thoughtful, as if weighing whether to tell him something. "I like it here," she began slowly, her small voice almost a whisper. "It feels like home." Derek smiled, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "It is your home now, sweetheart. You can stay here forever." Lily nodded, but she looked down, picking at the fabric of her dress. "But what if you change your mind?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Lily, why would you think I'd change my mind?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. She shrugged, not meeting his gaze. "At the orphanage, sometimes people would come to meet us, and we'd hope they'd take us home. But then, they'd leave and never come back. I don't want that to happen again." Derek felt a swell of anger and sadness rise within him, knowing she had spent her young life feeling disposable, afraid of being unwanted. He reached out and pulled her into his lap, wrapping his arms around her, his voice gentle but steady. "Lily, I'm never going to leave you. You're my daughter, and nothing will ever change that. I promise." She clung to him tightly, her small hands grasping his shirt as if anchoring herself to him. "Really?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Really?" he murmured, kissing the top of her head. "You're mine, and I'm yours. Forever." They stayed like that for a long time, her breathing finally calming as he held her close, letting the promise of permanence sink in. Over the next few weeks, Derek and Lily began to fall into a routine. Mornings were spent at the park, where he taught her to ride a bike, guiding her with steady hands and encouraging laughter. Afternoons were filled with trips to museums and libraries, where she soaked up knowledge like a sponge, her curiosity never ceasing to amaze him. One afternoon, as they were returning home from a small art fair, Lily took his hand, her face thoughtful. "Daddy," she said, still getting used to the new word, "can we go to the big park? I want to see the flowers again." He nodded, knowing exactly where she meant. Central Park, specifically the conservatory garden, had become a favorite spot for her. She loved the flower beds, the arches, the colors. It was as if she could spend hours there and never get bored. As they strolled through the winding paths, Lily pointed out her favorite flowers, her eyes lighting up with every bloom. They came to a stop near a cluster of wildflowers, and she crouched down, her little hands carefully touching each petal. Derek watched her, a mix of pride and tenderness swelling in his chest. Then, without warning, Lily looked up at him, a curious expression on her face. "Daddy, do you think my mom would have liked these flowers?" The question caught him off guard, and for a moment, he felt the familiar ache of loss. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before he answered. "Yes, Lily, she would have loved them. She had a beautiful garden, just like this, at our old house. She would have shown you all her favorite plants, and I think she'd be very proud of you." Lily nodded, seemingly satisfied. She picked a small flower and handed it to him, her smile soft. "Then we can take this one to her, so she knows we remember her." The innocence and thoughtfulness of her gesture made his throat tighten, but he managed to smile, accepting the flower as if it were the most precious gift he'd ever received. "Thank you, Lily. I think she'd love that." They continued their walk, the setting sun casting warm hues over the park, and Derek felt a quiet peace settle over him. Despite all the hardship and the years of emptiness, he had finally found his place, and it was here, holding his daughter's hand. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Derek sat in his study, sifting through some of Grace's belongings he hadn't been able to part with. Among them was a box filled with letters, journals, and photos of their time together. As he looked through the faded images, he realized he wanted to share these memories with Lily, to help her understand the woman who had brought her into the world. The next morning, he found Lily in the kitchen, her hair still tousled from sleep as she reached for a bowl to make cereal. He smiled, ruffling her hair. "How about we do something special today?" Her eyes lit up, and she nodded eagerly. "What is it?" "Would you like to see some pictures of your mom?" he asked, watching her carefully for her reaction. Lily looked up at him, her face a mixture of curiosity and excitement. "Yes, please." They spent the day in the study, Lily curled up next to him as he showed her photos of Grace, telling her stories of their time together. He shared memories of Grace's kindness, her laughter, and her endless love for flowers and art. He watched as Lily's face lit up, soaking in each detail, her small fingers tracing the faces in the photographs as if they held a secret she was just beginning to understand. When they came across a photo of Grace sitting by a window, surrounded by wildflowers, Lily pointed excitedly. "Look, Daddy, she's in her happy place, just like the one I drew." Derek felt a pang of wonder and sorrow, realizing how much Grace had influenced their daughter even without ever meeting her. "Yes, sweetheart," he whispered. "She's exactly where she wanted to be." They spent hours that day, lost in memories and stories, and for the first time, Derek felt as if Grace were truly with them. It was as though a part of her spirit had woven itself into their lives, binding them together in an unbreakable bond. As the weeks turned into months, Derek saw Lily blossom in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her laughter filled the house, her drawings covered the walls, and the once empty mansion felt alive again. But as her world expanded, Derek noticed she still carried remnants of her past, a certain quietness in her eyes, a wariness that sometimes surfaced in unexpected ways. One evening, as they were saying goodnight, Lily looked up at him, a flicker of worry in her gaze. "Daddy," she said, her voice tentative. What if I forget about the orphanage and all the people there?" Derek knelt beside her, holding her hands. "Lily, just because you're here now doesn't mean you have to forget anything. Your memories are yours to keep, and everyone who cared about you will always be a part of who you are." She nodded slowly, a faint smile crossing her face. "But now I have you." "Yes," he said softly, his heart swelling. "You have me, and I have you." As he turned out her light and closed her door, Derek knew he was no longer just a man running from his grief. He was a father, a protector, and most importantly, he was the man who would ensure that Lily would never feel alone again. It was a brisk autumn afternoon, and Derek was preparing the house for a quiet evening with Lily. He had planned to cook dinner. A simple pasta, nothing elaborate, but something that they could make together. He had discovered, to his delight, that Lily loved being in the kitchen. She had taken to helping him cook by stirring sauces, setting the table, and making messes that she gleefully promised to clean up later. As they moved around the kitchen, Derek handed her a wooden spoon and showed her how to stir the pasta sauce carefully so it wouldn't splatter. "Like this, Daddy?" she asked, her brows furrowing in concentration. "Just like that," he confirmed, smiling. "You're a natural." Lily beamed, and for a moment, he was struck by how much joy she brought into his life with such simple moments. The house felt warm and alive, as if every corner echoed with her laughter and tiny footsteps. The quiet mansion he once dreaded coming home to was now a place he couldn't wait to return to, all because of her. As they sat down to eat, Derek noticed Lily had fallen quiet, her expression turning thoughtful. She picked at her food, her mind seemingly elsewhere. He felt a pang of worry, sensing that something was on her mind. "Lily, is everything okay?" he asked gently. She looked up, hesitating before she spoke. "There's something I've been thinking about, Daddy," she said, her voice small and uncertain. He put down his fork, giving her his full attention. "You can tell me anything, sweetheart." She nodded, seeming to gather her thoughts. "When I was at the orphanage, sometimes people would come to visit, and the kids would wonder if they'd take us home." She paused, glancing down. "But a lot of the time, people would just leave, and we wouldn't know why." Derek felt his heart twist as he watched her. It was painful to think of her waiting, hoping, and then feeling the sting of disappointment. "That must have been hard," he said softly. She nodded, her eyes filled with a maturity that seemed too heavy for someone so young. I'm afraid that one day you'll leave too." The words cut him deeply, and he reached across the table, taking her small hands in his. "Lily, listen to me," he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I am never going to leave you. You're my daughter, and nothing will ever change that. I will always be here for you, no matter what." She searched his face, as if looking for confirmation in his eyes. "Really? Even if I'm not perfect?" Derek's heart broke at her words, but he held her hands tightly, hoping to reassure her. "Lily, I don't expect you to be perfect. I love you just the way you are. You're my family now, and nothing will ever change that." A slow smile crept onto her face, and she nodded, as if finally allowing herself to believe him. "Okay," she whispered. They finished their dinner, and afterward, Lily went off to draw while Derek tidied up. As he washed the dishes, he felt a familiar surge of determination. He had to do more than just tell her she was safe. He had to show her, to give her a life that would erase the doubts and fears left behind by her years in the orphanage. A few days later, Derek received an unexpected call from a former social worker who had been involved in Lily's case. After verifying Derek's identity, she informed him that Lily's last foster family, the one she had been with before moving to St. Anne's, had come forward with some information they thought might be important. "Mr. Lawson," the woman said, her voice serious, "they mentioned some details about Lily's birth that might interest you." Derek's heart skipped a beat. "What details?" "Well, her last foster parents recalled that there were unusual circumstances surrounding her arrival. Lily was transferred to several different facilities before she ended up with them, and there was always a peculiar note in her file, something about her not being intended for adoption at all. No one quite knew what it meant." A chill ran down Derek's spine. He had assumed the misplacement of Lily in the adoption system was a simple error, a tragic mistake, but now he was beginning to wonder if there was more to it. "Can I meet with her former foster parents?" Derek asked, his voice filled with urgency. "Of course. I can arrange for you to meet with them. They're in a small town just a couple of hours from you." Later that week, Derek made the drive. He arrived at a modest house, set back from the road, surrounded by overgrown trees. The home's owners, the Bennetts, greeted him at the door, their faces a mix of surprise and caution. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Derek said, shaking their hands. Mrs. Bennett, a kind-looking woman with graying hair, nodded. "We're happy to help. Lily was such a sweet girl. We think of her often." They invited him inside, offering him a seat in their cozy living room, and he felt their warmth, a glimpse of the care they must have given to Lily during her time with them. "We only had her for a few months before she was transferred to the orphanage," Mr. Bennett explained, his voice filled with regret. "But we always felt something wasn't right." Mrs. Bennett nodded, her expression pained. "We were told she came from a family that had meant to keep her, but there was some kind of mistake in the paperwork. I tried to follow up, but every time I asked, it seemed like there was another layer of red tape. More questions than answers." Derek leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Did anyone mention who her birth family might have been?" Mrs. Bennett shook her head. "No. All we were told was that she'd been placed in the system accidentally." "I'm so sorry. I wish we could tell you more." Derek's mind raced. There was something more here, something hidden, and he felt a rising frustration at the barriers that kept him from piecing together the full truth. As he thanked the Bennetts and left their home, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, knew more about Lily's past than they were letting on. He resolved to find out who and why. Back at home, Derek noticed Lily watching him carefully. She seemed to sense his unrest, her eyes tracking him as he moved around the kitchen. He tried to mask his worry, but her gaze was steady, almost penetrating. "Daddy?" she asked softly as they sat down for dinner. "Are you okay?" He looked up, startled by her question. "Yes, Lily, I'm okay. Just thinking about some things." She nodded, her small face serious. "You can tell me if you're worried. I won't mind." Her words, so mature and thoughtful, tugged at his heart. He reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Thank you, sweetheart. I promise, I'll tell you anything important. But for now, let's just enjoy our dinner." She smiled, her worries seemingly eased, and they ate in comfortable silence, the warmth of their bond filling the space between them. But as Derek cleared the table that night, he knew he couldn't let the mystery rest. For Lily's sake, he needed to uncover the full story, to put to rest the questions that had haunted both of their lives. And as he looked down at her, seeing the gentle trust in her eyes, he made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth, no matter what it took. Derek had never been a man to give up easily, and now, with each passing day, his determination to uncover Lily's past only intensified. He knew that unraveling her story meant something deeper than simply finding answers. It was a matter of giving his daughter the sense of security she so deeply needed. He wanted to fill every gap, replace every shadow of doubt with the certainty that she belonged, not just to him but to a family, her family. One morning, as he was drinking his coffee, he received a call from the investigator he had hired to help him dig into Lily's past. The voice on the other end of the line was cautious, but held a sense of discovery. "Mr. Lawson, I think I may have found a lead," the investigator said, his tone careful but intrigued. "There's a woman, a retired nurse, who worked at the hospital where Lily was initially taken as an infant. Her name's Laura Jensen, and she's now living in a small town a few hours away." Derek's pulse quickened. Another nurse. Another possible link in the chain of events that had separated him from Lily for all these years. Without hesitation, he cleared his schedule, packed a few things for the drive, and told Martha to reschedule his afternoon meetings. That afternoon, he set off with a single purpose: to uncover the truth, once and for all. The drive was long and winding, the roads becoming narrower as he left the city behind. Trees lined the path, their leaves beginning to show the first signs of autumn's colors. He arrived in a modest, quiet town where time seemed to have slowed, every building and street corner feeling untouched by the rush of modern life. Following the directions given to him, he found Laura Jensen's home, a small, white-clapboard house with a worn porch and a garden of wildflowers that reminded him of the drawings Lily had always loved to make. When he knocked, an elderly woman opened the door, her gaze sharp despite her age. She eyed him curiously, studying his face before finally speaking. "You must be Derek Lawson," she said, as if expecting him. He nodded. "Yes, Miss Jensen. I came because I believe you might know something about my daughter, Lily." The name seemed to soften her, and she opened the door wider, gesturing for him to come inside. "Come in, Mr. Lawson. There's much to talk about." They sat down in her cozy living room, where the faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. Laura poured them both a cup of tea, and Derek could barely contain his impatience as she took her time settling into her seat. "Tell me what you know, Miss Jensen," he urged gently. She set her cup down, folding her hands in her lap as she met his gaze. "Lily came into this world under difficult circumstances. I was working the night she was born. Her mother, your wife, Grace, was a remarkable woman. She fought so hard, but in the end, her body couldn't take it." Derek's throat tightened at the memory, but he forced himself to stay focused, listening intently as she continued. "When it was clear Grace wasn't going to make it, the doctors tried to save the baby. Lily was taken to the nursery, and we did everything we could to keep her stable. She was a small, fragile thing, but strong-willed even then." A faint smile crossed Laura's face, a glimmer of affection. Derek leaned forward. "But what happened after that? How did she end up in the adoption system?" "I was never told anything," Laura sighed, her expression clouding with regret. "That was the tragedy, Mr. Lawson. There was a mistake in the paperwork. During the chaos, Lily was registered as a newborn without family. And by the time we realized the error, she had already been placed under temporary guardianship in a foster home. We tried to fix it to reach you, but things became complicated." Derek clenched his fists, the frustration building inside him. "Complicated? What does that mean?" She looked away, her voice growing softer. "There were people who didn't want you to know. It wasn't just a mistake, Mr. Lawson. Someone deliberately covered up the truth. I never found out why, but there were whispers that certain records had been intentionally destroyed, and I was warned to stay quiet." The room grew silent, tension heavy in the air as Derek absorbed her words. "You're saying someone wanted to keep Lily from me?" he asked, disbelief mingling with anger. "Yes," she replied, her voice filled with quiet sorrow. "And I regret not doing more to stop it. But at the time, I had little power to change things. I'm so sorry, Mr. Lawson. I had hoped she'd find her way back to you someday." The implications of her words settled over him like a dark cloud, a storm of emotions swirling within him. Someone had stolen years from him, taken his daughter away from him, and allowed her to grow up alone. He thought of Lily, her quiet moments of fear, her doubts that she could ever truly belong. Every one of those scars was now tied to this betrayal, to people who had chosen to abandon her for reasons he couldn't yet understand. Derek stood, his hands shaking as he held back the anger that simmered beneath the surface. "Thank you, Ms. Jensen," he said, his voice strained. "I can't undo what happened, but I can make sure she never feels alone again." She nodded, reaching out to place a gentle hand on his arm. "You're a good man, Derek. Lily's lucky to have you." As he walked back to his car, Derek felt the weight of the years he and Lily had lost pressing down on him. But he also felt a fierce determination rising within him. He would uncover the truth, no matter where it led, no matter who was behind it. And he would do everything in his power to heal the wounds they had left in his daughter's heart. When he arrived back home that night, Derek found Lily curled up on the couch, half asleep with a book in her hands. She stirred as he entered, rubbing her eyes and smiling sleepily at him. "Daddy," she mumbled, stretching her arms toward him. He scooped her up, carrying her to her room as she rested her head against his shoulder. "Did you have a good day, sweetheart?" he asked softly. "Yeah, I drew pictures and read books. Martha said I should make a picture for you," she murmured, her voice growing softer with each word. He smiled, brushing a hand over her hair. "I'd love that, Lily." As he tucked her into bed, he sat beside her for a moment, watching her as she drifted off to sleep. He thought of the secrets he had uncovered, the people who had kept her from him, and he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would do more than just protect her from now on. He would make sure she felt safe, loved, and wanted, things she had been denied for too long. That night, as he sat alone in the quiet of his study, Derek pulled out his phone and dialed his investigator's number once more. When the man picked up, Derek's voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of his resolve. "Find out who covered this up," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "I want every name, every detail. I don't care what it takes." The investigator agreed, promising to leave no stone unturned, and as Derek hung up, he felt the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. Whatever it took, whoever it involved, he would ensure that justice was done, not just for himself, but for Lily. She deserved to know the truth, and he would stop at nothing to give it to her. The next morning, as they shared breakfast, Lily chattered away about her plans for the day, her voice bright and happy. Derek watched her, his heart swelling with love and pride, and he knew, without a doubt, that he would fight for her with everything he had until she had all the answers and all the love she would ever need. Over the following weeks, Derek's life centered around two things: strengthening his bond with Lily and unraveling the truth of her past. His days were filled with small moments of laughter and discovery with her, while his nights were consumed by late calls with his investigator, combing through files and chasing the elusive threads of a mystery that had haunted him since the day he discovered Lily was his daughter. One evening, as they sat together on the living room floor, surrounded by her art supplies, Derek felt a calm he hadn't known in years. They were drawing side by side, and Lily was happily adding wildflowers to a meadow scene she was creating. She looked up, her green eyes meeting his. "Daddy, can we go visit where you grew up someday?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement. "I want to see all the places you used to go with my mom." He smiled, touched by her curiosity. "Of course, Lily. I'd love to show you. Maybe next weekend. We can make a trip out there." She clapped her hands, her smile widening. "I want to see everything," she declared. "And you can tell me all the stories." As he nodded, a flicker of worry passed through him. He wanted to give her everything, but he knew that they couldn't fully move forward without facing the hidden truths of her past. And he was determined to uncover every single one of them. Later that week, Derek's investigator called with new information, his voice laced with urgency. "Mr. Lawson, I found something important," he began. "There were deliberate actions taken to conceal Lily's connection to you, things that go beyond just missing paperwork. It appears that someone went through considerable lengths to bury her identity." Derek gripped the phone tighter, his pulse quickening. "Do you know who's responsible?" The investigator hesitated. "Not yet, but I've tracked down a lawyer who might have been involved. A man named Richard Halston. He managed several unusual cases at the hospital where Lily was born, and he has a reputation for handling sensitive situations for influential clients. I believe he was the one who orchestrated the paperwork that ultimately separated Lily from you." A cold anger surged through Derek. "Where can I find him?" "I'll send you his address. But be careful, Mr. Lawson. This man has powerful connections." Derek thanked him and hung up, feeling a steely resolve settle over him. This man, this Richard Halston, had played a role in tearing his family apart, and now, finally, Derek had a chance to confront him. The next morning, Derek stood outside a polished office building, his hands shoved in his coat pockets as he watched people bustle in and out. He scanned the names on the building directory, his eyes stopping when he found Richard Halston and Associates. Taking a steadying breath, he entered, crossing the lobby to a private elevator that took him up to the law firm's offices. The receptionist greeted him politely, but there was a slight hesitation when he mentioned Halston's name. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice. "No," Derek replied calmly, though his tone left no room for argument. "But I'm sure he'll want to make time for me." After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, picking up the phone to announce his arrival. Within minutes, a sharply dressed man in his 60s appeared, his face a carefully crafted mask of professionalism. He studied Derek with a reserved expression before offering a polite but distant smile. "Mr. Lawson," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Richard Halston. Please, come into my office." Derek followed him into a spacious room lined with leather-bound books and a large mahogany desk. Halston took a seat, gesturing for Derek to do the same. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Halston asked, his voice smooth and practiced. Derek leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "I think you know why I'm here, Mr. Halston. I'm here about my daughter, Lily." For the briefest moment, Halston's mask slipped, a flicker of recognition passing through his eyes before he quickly composed himself. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're referring to, Mr. Lawson." "Don't insult me," Derek replied coldly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you were involved in the adoption case surrounding my daughter. I know you orchestrated the paperwork to ensure she was placed in the system as if she had no family. And I know it was all a lie." Halston's expression hardened. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. Any adoption procedures I oversaw were handled legally and ethically." "Legally and ethically?" Derek echoed, his voice thick with contempt. "You mean to tell me that separating a newborn from her father without his knowledge or consent was ethical? That covering up the truth was legal?" Halston's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, he dropped his polite facade. "Mr. Lawson, I suggest you tread carefully. There are people involved in these matters who would not appreciate their business being questioned." Derek leaned forward, his voice steady but deadly. "I don't care who's involved. I want to know why. Why was my daughter taken from me? Why was her identity hidden, her family erased?" Halston looked at him, a glint of something unspoken in his eyes. "Some things are beyond your control, Mr. Lawson. There were interests that had a stake in keeping certain matters quiet. And that's all I'm going to say." Derek clenched his fists, every fiber of his being seething with rage. "Let me make this very clear, Halston. I will not stop until I find out everything. And when I do, I'll make sure everyone involved pays for what they did to Lily." Halston's mouth twisted into a faint, condescending smile. "Be careful, Mr. Lawson. You may not like what you uncover. Sometimes the past is better left buried." But Derek stood, his gaze never wavering. "That's a risk I'm willing to take." Without another word, he turned and left, the doors of the office slamming shut behind him. As he walked out of the building, he felt a surge of clarity. He knew he was getting closer to the truth. Whatever secrets had kept him from Lily, he was determined to drag them into the light. Back at home, Derek found himself unusually quiet, lost in thought as he went through the motions of their evening routine with Lily. She seemed to pick up on his mood, watching him with concerned eyes as he helped her with her schoolwork. "Daddy, are you okay?" she asked softly, placing her hand on his. He looked down at her, a wave of warmth softening the tension in his chest. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm just working through some things." She nodded, accepting his answer, but after a pause, she asked, "Is it about me?" Derek's heart twisted. "Why do you ask that?" "Sometimes I see you looking at my baby pictures or talking on the phone about people I don't know," she said, her voice careful. "It's okay if it's about me. I just want to help." He felt a pang of pride mixed with sadness, marveling at her perceptiveness. "It is about you, Lily," he admitted. "I'm trying to understand what happened when you were a baby. I want to know why we were kept apart. I want you to know the truth, so you never have to wonder if you belong here." She thought about that, her eyes thoughtful, and then she reached out, hugging him tightly. "I don't need the truth to know that I belong with you, Daddy," she whispered. "I already know." He closed his eyes, holding her close, the weight of her words filling him with a deep, quiet resolve. She trusted him completely, and he wouldn't let her down. As he tucked her into bed that night, he whispered a promise to himself and to her. No matter what it took, he would find out who was behind the lies that had stolen years from them. And when he did, he would make sure that nothing, not power, not threats, not secrets, would ever come between him and his daughter again. The morning was quiet and cold as Derek sat at his desk, a single folder lying open before him. Inside were pages of reports, emails, and copies of records, evidence meticulously gathered over weeks of investigation. This was the final piece, the culmination of all his efforts. The truth was finally in his hands, laid bare in black and white, and he felt both vindicated and haunted by what he'd uncovered. A tangled web of influence and greed had kept Lily from him. Powerful interests had pushed her into the system, covering up her true identity for reasons that stretched beyond simple errors or oversight. The man behind it all had been someone with close ties to his former father-in-law, a figure who once saw Derek's world of corporate success as a threat to his control over Grace's legacy. To this man, Derek's grief and Lily's identity were merely collateral damage in a scheme to preserve influence, reputation, and wealth. But Derek now had the proof, every thread unraveled, every secret exposed. He took a deep breath, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He was relieved, but also filled with a simmering anger and sadness. They had stolen years from him and from Lily, years they could never get back. But at least now, he could finally close that chapter, knowing he had done everything in his power to uncover the truth. That evening, Derek picked Lily up from school, determined to give her the news in a way that would help her understand, without burdening her with the dark complexities of the adult's actions. She deserved to know the truth, but she also deserved to feel safe and loved. As they walked through the park on their way home, he held her hand, feeling the warmth of her small fingers in his, the gentle squeeze that never failed to comfort him. "Lily," he began, his voice soft, "there's something I want to talk to you about. Something I've been working hard to understand." She looked up at him, her eyes curious but trusting. "Is it about the people you were trying to find?" He nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yes. I wanted to know why we were kept apart for so long, why I didn't know about you. And now, I finally have answers." Lily tilted her head, listening closely. He had always been honest with her, and he knew that was the only way he could tell her this story. A long time ago, when you were just a baby, some people made decisions that weren't fair. They thought they were protecting something important, but they did it in a way that hurt both of us. He paused, watching her expression. "They kept us apart, Lily. They made it hard for us to find each other. But that's over now. We're together, and nothing will ever change that." She was quiet, processing his words, and then she squeezed his hand a little tighter. "Why would they do that, Daddy?" He knelt down beside her, looking into her eyes. "Sometimes, people let fear and selfishness guide them, and they forget how much harm they can cause. But what matters now is that we're here, together. We have each other, and we always will." Lily seemed to take comfort in his words, a small, thoughtful smile spreading across her face. "So, it doesn't matter anymore?" Derek's heart softened. "No, sweetheart, it doesn't matter anymore. All that matters is our future." They continued their walk, the leaves crunching beneath their feet, and for the first time in months, Derek felt a sense of peace. He had fought and won, not in the way he had once imagined, with power and force, but with resilience and patience. He had rebuilt his life around Lily, choosing her needs, her future, above everything else. And now, they could finally move forward without the shadow of the past looming over them. That weekend, Derek took Lily to visit his childhood home, just as he had promised. They drove through winding roads, the landscape changing from city skyscrapers to open fields and clusters of trees. As they pulled up to the old house, a cozy two-story nestled among tall pines, Lily's eyes lit up with excitement. "Is this where you grew up?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Yes," Derek replied, smiling. "I played here, ran through these woods, and even got into a little trouble now and then." Lily giggled as they stepped out of the car, running ahead to explore the front yard. Derek followed, feeling the bittersweet joy of revisiting the memories of his youth. He showed her the backyard where he used to build forts, the tree he once climbed with his brothers, and the little garden his mother had tended. As they walked through the house, Lily spotted a small photo of his parents on a shelf. She picked it up carefully, looking back at him. "They look nice." "They were," Derek said, his voice filled with warmth. "They would have loved you." They spent the day there, talking and laughing, sharing stories, and creating new memories in a place that held so many of his own. By the time they left, the sky had turned a soft pink, the first stars twinkling in the distance. On the drive back, Lily's head rested against the window, her eyes drifting shut. Derek glanced over at her, his heart full and steady, knowing that they had finally, truly come home. Months passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. Lily grew more confident each day, her fears and doubts slowly fading as their bond grew stronger. Derek became her biggest supporter, attending every school play, cheering her on at soccer games, and helping her with homework late into the night. He filled their home with love and laughter, the empty rooms now alive with the sound of her voice and her footsteps echoing through the halls. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace reading together, Lily looked up, her eyes bright with a question. "Daddy, do you think Mom would be happy?" she asked, her voice filled with the innocent wonder of a child. Derek smiled, feeling the familiar ache of Grace's memory, but also a deep, lasting joy. "Yes, Lily," he replied. "She would be so proud of you. And she'd be happy knowing that we're together." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, and they sat there in silence, the fire crackling softly as the night settled around them. Derek closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the moment wash over him, grateful for the journey that had led him here, to this family he had fought so hard to rebuild. In the end, he realized that the pieces of their lives had found their way back together, not in the way he had once expected, but in a way that felt even more profound. They were stronger, bound by something deeper than blood, something forged through resilience and love. And as he held his daughter close, Derek knew with a certainty that they had finally found their way home, that their family was complete, and that the future they shared would be filled with the happiness and peace he had once thought impossible. The past had lost its hold, and their lives, whole and filled with promise, lay ahead, bright and beautiful.